My So-Called Haunting is part of the Afterlife series by Tamsyn Murray. It is in fact the second book in the series, which I didn't realise until after I'd finished it, but turns out it doesn't really matter because the first one follows different characters and more works to set up the world as opposed to this specific story. So this book follows 14-year-old Skye Thackeray, who has just moved to London from Edinburgh whilst her mother is in Australia studying seahorses. But there's something people don't know about her. She has a secret. Skye is psychic, and this manifests itself in her being able to communicate with ghosts. Essentially, she's the main character from Sixth Sense, but instead of Bruce Willis, she's haunted by the ghost of some grumpy old witch. Skye is currently living with her aunt Celestine and her aunt's boyfriend Jeremy. Celestine is also psychic and works at the Dearly Departed, or Dearly D, a church for psychic people and ghosts, where she acts as a sort of messenger between the dead and the living, and helps ghosts to move on. One day, Skye is tasked with befriending Dante, a ghost at the Daily D, to help him with his unfinished business, which would be fun if she wasn't also trying to juggle making friends and having a love life at the same time. You can probably already tell that this is not a book aimed at adults. I therefore am obviously not going to judge it as a book aimed at adults, but instead as a book for the older child/teenage demographic. This is also a book that I'm sure was very modern in 2010 when it was written, but sadly a few details such as MSN and only looking into Facebook on a home computer after school does date this rather. Not necessarily an issue, but it did make me laugh, and in a few years, as those too young to remember the days of MSN and Facebook as a website as opposed to an app pick this up, it could possibly cause confusion. The main reason I picked this book up, of course, despite it being aimed at people at least 10 years my junior, is because I love the whole trope of someone can see ghosts but no one else can. Hijinks ensue. It's one of my favourite setups because it's so versatile. It can be as serious or comedic as you like. The idea of seeing ghosts can link to so many themes and character arcs and emotional journeys. You can show change, either through how the character responds to ghosts or how other characters respond to the ghost seer. But it still gives ample space to stamp your own ideas. Are people genetically predisposed to see ghosts? Did something happen to give them this ability, or is it random? Do the ghosts look like normal people, or do they look like ghosts? Are there rules as to where the ghosts can go or what they can do? Why do some people become ghosts and others not? The only thing you need to do is make sure that there is a reason the character who can see ghosts can see ghosts. And I don't mean an in-world reason, a character reason. Whether it's to illustrate a character flaw or journey, highlight issues in society, or just add that dash of bittersweet symbolism to reflect the emotional core of the story. There needs to be a reason. But because the reasons are so many and versatile, it's easy to write something that works. Heck, even the American remake of Ghosts isn't terrible. And American remakes of British sitcoms are always terrible. Apart from that one. But that's because the original had Ricky Gervais, and cutting out Ricky Gervais is always an improvement. As many teenage and children reads are, this is a really fun story. The plot ticks along without stopping too much. It's engaging, there are twists and turns. Predictable twists and turns, yes, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I like the characters. I think Skye is good as a main character, as she definitely acts like a 14-year-old. From, slightly questionable priorities, over-dramatic reactions to quite small things, and preoccupation with trying to be cool and fitting in whilst remaining true to herself, it all feels very genuine and is the sort of teenage experience that doesn't become dated after a few years, as MSN does. I also like that Skye is really short, because I was really short at school and people commented on a lot, so that felt quite genuine. I also quite like Jeremy, who acts as a sort of dad or uncle figure to Skye. Very supportive and genuine, but also really uncool, so sort of uncool uncle. The friend doesn't appear much, and I've already forgotten her name, but she's also good fun. Annoying, but in that believable teenage way. I also have to give this book credit for making an attempt to tackle some pretty serious subjects. Gang culture, drugs, relationships, death, obviously, suicide. It's all featured, and not just in the background. One of the main plots is about gangs and young people being absorbed into them. And the book opens with this depiction of suicide. I mean, sure, it turns out to be a ghost just reliving her suicide, but still, it is described. And these are relevant topics. A lot of people, especially teenagers, struggle with these things even today. So I have to applaud the fact that Tamsyn Murray, upon deciding to write a light-hearted, ghostly romp, also said, I'm going to add a layer of serious authenticity by tackling these very real subjects. On the whole, it is too simply written. And I understand why. Although Skye is 14, the demographic for this realistically is going to be more 11 to 14, perhaps younger. So it does err that line between teenage and children's fiction, but the simple style of writing doesn't mesh very well with the more serious topics. I also would have liked more description. There is some, but mostly it describes characters' appearances, so I would have liked more scene-setting description to help immerse us in the world and the story. The opening, for example, which, as I've mentioned, features this suicide, would have had more impact if it had been described to give us that sense of horror, that emotional gut punch, instead of us being told by the narrator that she saw a suicide and only having her reaction to inform ours. Obviously, I'm not saying she should have overloaded this with description and complex vocabulary. After all, serious subjects should be accessible to those whose reading ages don't necessarily reflect their actual age. But it feels like the sort of book which would be a good gateway to entice young people to start challenging themselves. Whilst I thought the teenagers were mostly believable, I did not buy their dialogue, primarily because the language is too clean. I am British. I went to a British school, and let me tell you, British teenagers swear like sailors. I didn't and don't, but I'm an exception. No one got called a wanker. This book is clearly fake news. The main love rival for Skye, a girl called Ellie, feels like a character from fan fiction. They're sort of the nasty girl who simpers over the love interest to both make him more appealing and make the main character look nicer and thus more deserving of a happy ending with the appealing love interest. Fortunately, Ellie doesn't really feature that much, and there is far more to the plot than just romance, so it's not as bad as it could have been. It didn't feel that British either, which is curious because the author actually lives in London. I can't quite explain it, but if you had told me that this was set in America, I would have believed it. The only British elements really were place names, such as Hackney, because it's set in London, and one character calling Skye a short ass, which is quite British. Maybe it was use of things like registration, because when I was in school it was called form, and I really only heard registration as being from American TV shows. I don't know, it seemed to be missing an element of British identity. This is quite a short book, quite narrow, and it should have been longer. I would have appreciated more time and more pages dedicated to the development of characters and relationships, especially the relationship between Skye and the annoying witch ghost Mary who haunts their house. Also between Skye and Dante. Not that there wasn't any relationship development there, because there is, but I suppose as a lover of friendships and that, and all the banter that goes with it, I wanted a bit more. I thought the way that some of the plot lines ended was a bit disappointing. We're heading into spoiler territory here, so be warned. There are two plot lines essentially, the romance with hot guy Nico and the ghosty plot line with Dante. Skye fancies Nico immediately because he's hot, believable as a teenager. Nico seems to fancy Skye immediately for reasons, and they eventually start dating. Nico goes home briefly to Romania, where he takes part in some weird ritual to gain psychic powers and comes back evil. So Skye dumps him, obvs. And that's that storyline over and done with. I think maybe it continues in the next book, but in this book it felt really abrupt and a bit strange. The other plot line, so Dante's unfinished business is that his brother, who I think is called Nelson, but I forgot to double check, is being sucked into gang culture, likely due to Dante being murdered in a gang shoot-by. Is that what you call it? I have absolutely no idea. Drive-by, thank you, glamorous assistant. Skye has to try to stop him from doing something stupid and instead follow his dream to become a footballist. This all comes to head in a snooker club, as it so often does, where Nelson, armed with a gun, has been instructed to murder a rival gang leader who he has been told was the one who murdered Dante. Skye sneaks in to stop him. The other gang leader, who has instructed Nelson to kill the other guy, can't remember the names, which doesn't help. He turns up to reveal that he was the one who murdered Dante whilst twirling his moustache evilly. Then the rival gang leader reveals that he isn't the rival gang leader, but an undercover cop who's infiltrated the gangs to solve Dante's murder. Yet a cop managed to climb his way through the ranks to become a gang leader in 6 months without anyone realising. No. Even for a teenage book about ghosts, that is a step too far. In conclusion, it's a fine book. It's silly, yes, but you can tell from the blurb that it's not really meant to be taken seriously. I think it's a good gateway book for young teenagers and older kids to get into literature that looks into more serious subjects, but written in a very accessible way and with enough froth for immediate engagement, like a sprinkling of sugar on a bowl of porridge. Though in this case, it's more like a sprinkling of porridge oats on a bowl of sugar, but it's a start. Next time, we shall be delving back into a genre that never fails to disappoint, and yet I keep coming back for more. Goodbye.